The topic is natural cooperation. It is by Professor Martin Nowak from Harvard University, USA. I'd read a brief biodata about Professor Nowak. Professor Martin Nowak is currently a professor of mathematical biology at Harvard University and director of Harvard's program for evolutionary dynamics. He is one of the leading researchers in the field that studies the role of cooperation in evolution. In 1989, he earned his doctorate in biochemistry and mathematics from the University of Vienna. From 1989 to 1998, he was Erwin Schrödinger's postdoctoral scholar at University of Oxford. He held professorships at University of Oxford and IAS Princeton before moving to Harvard in 2003. Professor Nowak's research interests include evolution of cooperation, evolution of language, evolutionary game theory, and graph theory, somatic evolution of cancer, the dynamics of viruses and infectious diseases, pre-life and origins of life. He is famous for his proposal and works in showing evolution requires a third component called cooperation, in addition to the classical components of mutation and natural selection. Among his major discoveries are the mechanism of HIV disease progression, the first mathematical approach for studying the evolution of human language, the first quantification of the in vivo kinetics of human cancer, and the 5 rules for the evolution of cooperation. He has published over 300 papers in the world's leading scientific journals, including several in Nature and Science. He is a highly cited researcher with an H index of 159. He authored many well-received books, including Virus Dynamics, Evolutionary Dynamics, Super Cooperators, and Evolution, Games, and God. Professor Nowak is a corresponding member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. For his outstanding works, he has received enormous international recognition, including Oxford's Weldon Memorial Prize, the Albert Wander Prize of the University of Bern, the Akira Okabo Prize of the Society for Mathematical Biology, and so on. So we are eager to listen to you, Professor Nowak. Am I audible to you, sir?
Thank you so much. It's a very great honor for me to be there. And unfortunately, I have never been in India personally, but I have given already several talks there on Zoom. And also, I should mention that my research is also at the interface of science and religion. And Hinduism actually means very, very much to me. And for many, many years, I've studied the Bhagavad Gita and also Upanishads. And I'm also now writing books on these topics that bring a scientific worldview together with a spiritual worldview. And I like to embrace in this view all different religions, including my own religion, which is Christianity. But today my talk is just a scientific talk, and I will want to discuss with you the evolution of cooperation, and that cooperation is a fundamental principle of evolution. So I will try to share my screen here for the PowerPoint presentation, and then we will go here, and I hope you can see that.
Yes, sir, it is.
Excellent. So the title of my talk is Natural Cooperation. And cooperation is a principle that I consider fundamental for evolution, similar to natural selection. So natural selection proposed by Darwin and Wallace and others is sort of a driving principle of evolution, but implies that there's always a fight. And natural cooperation is quite the opposite. There's sort of not a fight, but there's helping each other. And here's an example of helping each other that came into existence 3 billion years ago. These are cells, cyanobacteria. Every so often a cell dies in order to feed the other cells with nitrogen. So a cell gives its life to support the lives of others. Here, a kind of cooperation that came into existence 125 million years ago. These are worker ants that do not reproduce themselves, but they help a sister, the queen, to reproduce. So they do not leave any offspring in the subsequent generation, but they help another individual to leave offspring in the subsequent generation. So they have zero fitness, but they still contribute to the ant colony. This is a painting of Vincent van Gogh that he painted in a mental asylum, actually, inspired by a work of Delacroix. This is the Good Samaritan of the New Testament. So the Good Samaritan helps a person who has been wounded, and it is an image that people want to help one another. So as much as fighting is going on between people, there are many instances of people helping each other. And in the end of my talk, I want to argue that cooperation is absolutely essential for the survival of the human species on Earth. And if we fail to cooperate on a global scale, we will actually undermine our own existence. This is a timeline of the major events that happened on Earth. This is how I begin my class every year at Harvard University. These are the very few dates that are sort of signifying the most important events as we understand them. The universe came into existence 13.8 billion years ago. Sun, Earth, and Moon came into existence 4.6 billion years ago. Approximately 4 billion years ago, there was the origin of life on Earth. There's definitive evidence of simple cells, so-called prokarya, 3.5 billion years ago. More complicated cells with nucleus and organelles come into existence 1.8 billion years ago. Complex multicellularity giving rise to animals and plants 600 million years ago. And then the one great thing that evolution discovered in the last 600 million years is really human language. And human language is definitely around for approximately 1 million years timescale. And human language is as significant as the origin of life because it gives rise to a new way of evolution. Evolution with human language is not only genetic, but can also proceed in the cultural realm. And this defines really our species. So what is it that evolves? If we look at the theory of evolution, we want to ask the question, what is it that evolves? And this question was asked by famous Harvard biologist Ernst Mayr in his book, What Evolution Is. And he says that loosely speaking, we talk about evolution of species, of genomes, of cells, of evolution of the brain. But this is all just figuratively speaking, because the only thing that really evolves are populations. Populations of reproducing individuals are the carriers of the evolutionary process. That which evolves is always a population. And populations, when they reproduce, they can give rise to new types. And that's called mutation. So the first principle of evolution is mutation. Mutation means new diversity arises over time. And the second principle of evolution is selection. Different types have different fitnesses, different reproductive rates, and therefore they grow at different rates. So over time, one type here, red, might outcompete another type, blue. And this is natural selection proposed by Darwin. And for many years, mutation and selection were the only principles of evolution, the major principles of evolution. They still are the major principles of evolution. But in the last 20 years, I have been advocating that we should really see cooperation as a third fundamental principle of evolution. And cooperation means that cells, for example, but in other cases, animals, humans, or plants, they work so closely with each other that they form a new unit. So cells help each other reproduce, but then more and more until they are a multicellular organism. And cooperation is so important because I see it as the master architect of evolution. Cooperation is present before the origin of life in a theory that I have called pre-life. Cooperation gives rise to protocells, the precursors of all cells in the origin of life. It gives rise to cells, to genomes, to cellular organelles, to simple cells, to multicellular structures, to animal societies and human language. In all of these major discoveries of evolution, cooperation played the leading role, and natural selection alone cannot explain this without the intermediate step of cooperation. So cooperation is the master architect of evolution. And that is actually a much more positive picture, because evolution then is not only just a fight, everybody against everybody else, but it is also very much a story of love and a story of cooperation. Love, especially then in the human realm, but helping one another and being there, and in a sacrificial way, being there for each other and for other cells on every level of biological organization. So what is cooperation? Cooperation is an interaction between at least two people. and one is a donor, so it could be cell or person, one is a donor and the other one is a recipient. The donor pays a cost and the recipient gets a benefit. And cost and benefit can be written down in the theory of evolution in terms of fitness, in terms of reproductive success. So this so-called donation game leads us now into a mathematical theory called game theory. So if you and I have the choice between cooperation and defection, then we end up with a payoff matrix. This is a payoff matrix. And here in the payoff matrix is written what you will get. So if I cooperate and if you cooperate, then I'm paying my cost such that you have a benefit, but because you cooperate, you pay a cost. So your payoff is benefit minus cost. The benefit of my cooperation and the cost of your cooperation. But if I defect, you have no benefit, only your cost. But if you defect and I cooperate, you have only benefit and no cost. And if you defect and I defect, you have zero. In the same way I have zero, there's neither benefit nor cost. This payoff matrix is the donation game, which is a special case of the famous prisoner's dilemma. And the parameters are such that benefit is greater than cost is greater than zero, and you have to make a choice whether to cooperate or defect. And if you want to analyze this game from the perspective of Nash equilibrium, which is the idea of rationality in a very limited sense, then you have to argue as follows. You don't know what I will do. So let's assume I might cooperate. If I cooperate, you have a choice between B and B minus C. B is better than B minus C. So if I cooperate, it is better for you to defect. You can assume I defect. Then you have a choice between minus C or zero, and zero is greater than minus C. So if I defect, it's also better for you to defect. So no matter what I do, it's better for you to defect in that game. And if you defect and I defect, we end up with payoff zero. And that's now very bad because we would have been better off, both of us, had we cooperated. And therefore, it's a dilemma. So Nash equilibrium leads to defection. But what we want is cooperation. We want to find cooperation. That would have been better. That would be better. So the dilemma is, do rational players in the narrow sense of economics defect and end up with a low payoff zero, but do irrational players might cooperate and receive a higher payoff B minus C? So we are in a field here that is a field of mathematics called game theory, and game theory was invented by the Hungarian genius John von Neumann, working together with the Austrian economist Oskar Morgenstern in Princeton. And they wrote a book and thereby invented the mathematical field of game theory. John von Neumann contributed to many fields of mathematics. He also built the first programmable computer at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Game theory was mostly developed for human and economic decision, but it was brought to biology by the work of John Maynard Smith, who was one of my mentors in Oxford, and also by my PhD advisor, Carl Sigmund in Vienna, who wrote important papers and books on bringing game theory to biology. And so evolutionary game theory is now the idea we go away from Nash equilibrium, we go away from rationality, we just think of very simple agents. So these agents could be cells. So we have a mixed population of cells here, and some of these cells cooperate, they help each other, and others defect. And in these random encounters, it's the case that defectors always have a higher payoff than cooperators. So if these encounters are completely random and nothing is happening, defectors will reproduce faster than cooperators, and in the end, the whole population will defect. So similar to rationality, also natural selection chooses defection, because in any mixed population, defectors have a higher payoff than cooperators. But as we have seen, cooperation is abundant in nature, and therefore we have to understand how natural selection can actually ever favor cooperators over defectors. And it needs help to favor cooperators over defectors. And this help is given in so-called mechanisms. And there are many tens of thousands of papers written on that problem, and I have classified them in 2006 into 5 mechanisms. There are 5 mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. And they are called direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, spatial selection, group selection, and kin selection. And I will mention the first three in my talk today. So these are interaction structures such that natural selection favors cooperation over defection. Direct reciprocity is the idea, I help you, you help me. So we are in a repeated situation. And in a repeated situation, it is no longer the Nash equilibrium that we always defect. This is the repeated prisoner's dilemma. We imagine two players, and in each round, they can choose between cooperation and defection. And now there's a famous theorem in economics, the Folk theorem, that says defection is not the only Nash equilibrium. You can actually get cooperative Nash equilibria. This is now a repeated game, and in that repeated game, we use strategies, and we can then ask, what is a good way to play a repeated encounter between humans? And that question was asked by Robert Axelrod in famous computer tournaments in the 1980s, and he conducted 2 computer tournaments, and in both of those tournaments, the simple strategy won, and it was submitted by famous game theorist Anatol Rappaport. And this strategy is tit for tat. I start with cooperation. If you cooperate, I will cooperate. If you defect, I will defect. And when I began my PhD thesis in Vienna with Carl Sigmund, this strategy was the world champion in playing the repeated prisoner's dilemma. And everybody thought that this was the best strategy for playing that game. But the problem was that this was really analyzed in a world without mistakes. So if mistakes are possible, then the strategy that I proposed in my PhD thesis is actually much better, and this strategy is generous tit for tat. So generous tit for tat is, I start with cooperation. If you cooperate, I will always cooperate. And if you defect, I will still cooperate with a certain probability. So I will not always cooperate, then you could exploit me, but I will sometimes cooperate. And that probability is under selection and has to achieve the correct level. But so we call this evolution of forgiveness. Natural selection of fierce competition leads to the ability to forgive defection and to respond with cooperation to defection. And this strategy is much better than tit for tat in a world where mistakes are possible, where miscommunication is possible, and where misjudgment is possible. Another strategy is win, stay, lose, shift. And this is, if I'm doing well, then I repeat my move. And if I'm doing badly, then I change my move. This is another strategy that is much better than tit for tat in the repeated prisoner's dilemma, also because it can correct occasional mistakes. But the important lesson here is that cooperation is never fully stable. So as opposed to economics, economists always ask questions about equilibrium. We never find equilibrium in biology. There are always cycles. It is always developing and being destroyed, developing and being destroyed. So cooperation is never here forever. It's always destroyed and has to be rebuilt. And human society has to live with these cycles of up and down and has to find mechanisms to rebuild cooperation quickly after it has been destroyed. Now I move to indirect reciprocity, and indirect reciprocity is the idea I help you and somebody will help me. Here the Good Samaritan again of Vincent van Gogh. It is not a repeated interaction between two players who know each other. It is a one-off encounter. If you are in that situation, you would wish somebody would help you. Here's another example of indirect reciprocity. This man was waiting in the subway in New York with his 2 daughters in the morning, and he observed another man with seizures, epileptic seizures, moving uncontrolled, and then suddenly falling on the tracks of the subway. And the other man was on the tracks of the subway, and the train was already pulling into the station, and this man jumped down before the train that was incoming in order to help the other person out away from the train. And then he realized it was too late, the train was too close. So he pushed him down between the tracks and he put himself over it, and he let the train pass over both of them unharmed. So he risked his own life to save the life of somebody else. And it is a very interesting aspect of humans that we actually do this. And you really have to ask, why do humans have such an instinct? Why are we willing to risk our own life to save the life of a complete stranger? And the answer is indirect reciprocity. Indirect reciprocity works via reputation. If A helps B, the reputation of A increases. If A does not help B, the reputation of A decreases. I proposed this framework together with Carl Sigmund in a paper in Nature in 1998. And the experimental confirmation is that people help those who help others, and helpful people have a higher payoff in the end. So you're doing well in the game by starting to help others, and as soon as you help others, people will also help you, and you have a higher payoff in the end. Games of indirect reciprocity use social intelligence and they use human language. We are talking to each other about others, what they have done, and what we admire about them, and therefore we proliferate their reputation. My friend David Haig at Harvard said, for direct reciprocity, you need a face. For indirect reciprocity, you need a name. So direct reciprocity, we must recognize others and know what they have done and how they behave. For indirect reciprocity, we must be able to talk to each other about others and learn about what they have done. For example, the Good Samaritan or the New York subway hero. So open problems for indirect reciprocity is that the social norms can be complicated and they can be vulnerable to noise and private information. There are interesting moral or ethical questions with indirect reciprocity. So if somebody is a bad person and has a bad reputation, but you still help this person, does this make you bad? So in some social norms, the answer is yes, and in other social norms, the answer is no. Likewise, does refusing to help a bad person make you good? It is in some social norms, yes, in some social norms, no, and there's many papers, mathematical papers also have been written on those questions in indirect reciprocity. And recently I worked on a paper together with some colleagues to give a unified framework for direct and indirect reciprocity. So one mathematical theory that captures both approaches. And just to remind you, direct reciprocity means my behavior depends on what you have done to me, but indirect reciprocity means my behavior also depends on what you have done to others. So the idea is that we have an interaction between two people, and let's say player one helps player two. So this is cooperation here. Then next step is player one helps player three. Next step is player one does not help player four, defects. And then the question is player three can now have an opportunity to interact with player one. What should player three do? Given that's the information. And if player three only responds to this move, this is what is called direct reciprocity. So I help you because you have helped me. But if that also takes into account what has happened here, that's indirect reciprocity. So indirect reciprocity is, I realize you have cooperated here, I realize you have defected here, and this will affect my decision. So here's a mathematical equation that takes into account both direct and indirect reciprocity, where xij is the probability that player I would cooperate with player j. And this is the difference equation. So in the next round, the probability has changed in that way. And wj is the probability that player j is chosen to act in this round. So if the player doesn't change, doesn't do anything, then the probability is not updated, it stays the same. But if the player is updated, then it could interact with player k, so with sum over all players k. We have here a parameter which is a tensor that takes into account that player I pays attention to the interaction between j and k. And this has the reactive response of player I, given that a cooperation or a defection happened between j and k. And so this is a simple equation that allows us to study direct and indirect reciprocity in one framework. And what we find here, if there's a very large number of rounds, then there is a parameter region where direct reciprocity and indirect reciprocity is both possible and can give rise to cooperation. But if error rate for indirect observation is very high, then only direct reciprocity is possible. If error rate is below a threshold, both direct and indirect reciprocity is possible. But if interaction of rounds is not too large, only indirect reciprocity is possible. And here in that region, we cannot get any cooperation, neither direct nor indirect reciprocity works. So we have a phase diagram where either indirect reciprocity works or direct reciprocity works or both work, depending on how many interactions there are in society and error rate for indirect observation. And what we find in this paper, it was published in Nature Human Behavior 2021, is that a very, very simple strategy works for both direct and indirect reciprocity, and this is called generous scoring. Generous scoring means always cooperate with someone who has a good reputation, sometimes cooperate with someone who has a bad reputation. Very similar to generous tit for tat, but now it works in the extended framework, unifying direct and indirect reciprocity. Next question is, can indirect reciprocity stabilize global cooperation? We are now really facing a problem in that it is not only necessary that we cooperate with friends and with neighbors, but we need to cooperate with people who live anywhere else on the globe, because humans have put the globe in very dangerous situation because of tremendous emissions, and we are undercutting the ecological system on which we depend. So here's the idea how indirect reciprocity can stabilize global cooperation. You can play a game where people interact with each other, but they can also cooperate or defect with respect to the global good, to the global ecosystem, the global environment. So you could buy an efficient car, reduce carbon emission, you cooperate with the global good. Then others might cooperate with you, or you can defect with the global good, and then others might defect with you. That's the idea. The idea is that indirect reciprocity in this way could stabilize global cooperation. So we performed an experiment here, it was published in 2016, where people participate in a large public goods game, and in that public goods game, they can either cooperate or defect, sort of for the whole world, for the whole group, either they can do something good or not do something good. And afterwards, they play pairwise interaction with the people aligned to them, sort of standing next to them in the cycle. So they can either cooperate or defect with each other. And if these decisions are based on what happened here, then cooperation in the public goods game is sustained. So the result was, if no information from the public behavior is triggering into the pairwise behavior, then the contribution in the public goods game goes down. But if information triggers in, the contributions stay high. So private responses to people can uphold public cooperation in global situations. So global cooperation is possible if indirect reciprocity stabilizes that situation. And this is based on what I call spatial selection, which is also evolutionary graph theory, and there are many papers on those topics. So societies where there's some structure of social network or friendship can actually uphold cooperation because friends help one another. And the last part of my talk is now cooperation is the future. In order to really help the human species survive on the globe, we need to do cooperative actions now that benefit subsequent generations. We have to pay a cost now such that afterwards people have a benefit. And if we don't do this, we destroy the ecosystem and we destroy the fundamental basis of human life on Earth. So we performed an experiment which was published in Nature in 2016, where we have 5 people and they are around a table, and on the table are 100 units. And this was first done with people in the Harvard Business School, and later it was done on the online in many different places with many people participating from all over the world. But first it was done with real people sitting around a lab situation table in the Harvard Business School. 100 units are on the table, and each person, each of 5 people can choose to harvest between 0 and 20. So you can make a choice here, but we are telling you afterwards, there is the next generation. So in the next room are 5 other people here, and they are waiting. They are waiting for your decision. And the game works like this. If you leave 50 units in the pot, we will replenish it, and the people can play the game. if you take out more than 50, it is exhausted, the resource is destroyed, and we put it to 0 and the game is over. So whatever you choose, you can choose freely, but it depends whether you leave 50 units inside or not. If you leave at least 50 inside, the next generation can play. If you take out more than 50, the next generation cannot play and the game is over. And moreover, we are telling you that you are the first generation, and after you comes the second generation, the third generation, and so on. There is a line of people waiting after you, and whether they can also harvest some benefit depends on your choice here. So each person chooses between 0 and 20. If every person chooses 10, 50 is left here, and it can continue. But if all people choose 10 and one person chooses 11, game is over. If one person chooses 20, game is over. So experimental, the people understand the rules of the game, and now we ask them, what do you want to do? And the surprising thing is that 80% of bulls were destroyed in the first round. So in 80% of cases, the first round destroyed the bull completely. All bulls were destroyed in at most 3 rounds. It was a very negative outcome. And the typical outcome was like this. One person here chooses to take 8, another person 10, 9, another person 10, another person 10, and one person 20. 43 is left here, and the game is over. It's a typical outcome. So then we ask people afterwards, why did you do this? And this person said, I know I would destroy the bull, but if I don't do it, somebody else will do it, and I lose out. So the greed inherent in humans and the worry about direct competition makes cooperation with the future impossible. And then we said, we change the experiment. Instead of each person choosing what to do and doing it, there is voting. So you can have voting and each person says a number and the median of those numbers is given to everybody. And this idea is harnessing the power of democracy. So we ask people to give a democratic vote, and then we will give the median to everybody equally. And in that treatment, voting sustained almost all bulls indefinitely. And our result was described in Nature by a comment, a caring majority secures the future. It is very interesting. So the majority of people vote for positive outcome, for cooperation with future generations. The vote itself is against their own benefit, but they still vote in favor of it. And this is an interesting observation. And so this is one mechanism how we could achieve cooperation on a global scale with future generations. But the problem really is that it needs a global and binding vote. We also had a treatment which we call partial voting, where some people or some countries, they make an agreement and other countries do not join the agreement. And this does not work. This destroys cooperation with the future. And now just taking a step in the last moments of my talk, this is a picture from another paper of mine about the history of life unfolding on Earth of the last 4.567 billion years. There are these 4 epochs of Earth history that are called Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, Phanerozoic. And down here, once again, you blow up the Phanerozoic in the last 635 million years, and you have emergence of macroscopic animals, Cambrian diversion, tetrapods, and so you have also the mass extinctions that happened, the mass extinction of dinosaurs. And here up here, you have the origin of life, and you have the oxygenic photosynthesis and simple multicellularity. And we humans, we are really in that moment. We are in this one small moment of time is when we find human species on Earth. And the key question that confronts us really is, for how long? For how long will intelligent life be present on Earth before it destroys itself? And the answer really depends on global cooperation and future generations. So for the stability of intelligent life on Earth, we need global cooperation and we need cooperation with future generations. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your wonderful talk. Yeah, we have a question from our end.
Good evening, Professor.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I have two questions. One is on the prisoner's dilemma, the matrix that you showed. If rationally both should not cooperate, and
Yes.
irrationally B minus C is the benefit. So here irrationally means crazy or irrationally means emotional?
No, it's very good question. Very good question. So I said rational here only means very narrow concept of rationality in terms of economics, in terms of Nash equilibrium. So a rational player in game theory is the one who understands the concept of Nash equilibrium and plays the Nash equilibrium. It is a very narrow definition of rationality employed in economics. And most experiments show that humans are not rational. You are right, I would call this emotional, but I would also just call it our instincts really come from situations that are slightly different. So the reason why we cooperate in the prisoner's dilemma, because most of our interactions are repeated and most of our interaction reputation matters, and therefore our instinct immediately tells us I should cooperate.
Thank you.
So it's not crazy at all. It's not crazy. Emotional is good, but also what you're doing is you're responding to a slightly different situation than the theory has presented, a repeated situation.
And towards the end, you had also told that we will always cooperate with people who are having good reputation, and uh, one of the final slides, and sometimes cooperate with those who have a bad reputation.
Uh-huh.
And but like I'm speaking from an Indian history background. There are some individuals who cooperate with all people all the time. It will not be a majority. Like towards the end, you said everybody needs to have a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to give a simple case, we had a ex-president called Abdul Kalam, and this one person, he has changed lives. Like he's one of, like, if he, in our generation, if we say anybody who is president material, it's him. And so there are some unique individuals who they come and then they set the example for others to follow. So it doesn't take this example I'm saying because it doesn't take care of the entire group as a whole, but one individual can come and he can change things. So where does that come in this evolution?
I'm very amazed by your question because in the last few years I have exactly worked on this question because I also like more than strategic cooperation. So I'm not fully satisfied with strategic cooperation. Strategic cooperation means that I help you if you help me, and I help you in order to get good reputation. I want more. So I have tried similar things as you mentioned, and also exactly as you mentioned. So I have asked myself, can I come up with game theory of love? What would be the game theoretic choice of a saint, of a very good person? And I have tried various approaches. And one approach that I have tried, and it's not published yet, is the approach of teacher. So I say there's a population of players, and everybody in that population is selfish, maximizing benefit, but using strategy. So could use tit for tat, generous tit for tat, whatever. But one person is a teacher, and the teacher operates differently. The teacher joins the society and asks, what do I have to do such that everybody in the long run will benefit from my presence? And then the teacher adopts a strategy that can turn the whole society to cooperate. So the surprising observation in mathematics was there exists a strategy the teacher can adopt such that everybody will cooperate in the end. Without the teacher, in the same situation, everybody would defect. And nobody knows that a teacher is present in that experiment. So that is one of our very recent results.
Actually, this is the last 50, 70 years of Indian history. If you see about the scientific advancements, it has always been started by one or two people. Like if you talk about the Indian nuclear program, or you talk about the Indian space research program, what I told about one person coming and setting example, it's basically the culture of ISRO. Indian Space Research Organization. Like if you, the scientist who first founded it, he had to justify the existence of the ISRO. Like he never saw the success, and he put his own personal wealth into building of ISRO. Vikram Sarabhai, and his biography says he put his own personal money for developing a lab, and one of his undergraduates, he destroyed the lab within a single day.
But
And
why?
no, experimental error, and the machine got destroyed. He said, no issues, I will buy another machine. Like normally we are afraid, like what will happen if I touch the equipment and it spoils. So he set that example. That was followed by Satish Dhawan. So Abdul Kalam that I said. So he has an interview in which he says, the first missile launch that they did in India, it cost some crores of rupees and it was a failure. So Satish Dhawan that time told, don't worry, I'll take care of the backlash. The next year when they got success, so he told APJ Abdul Kalam is the guy who made it successful. And then APJ Abdul Kalam says, this is a leader. When it's failure, he takes the fault on himself. And when it's success, he gives it to his juniors. And that is the culture. And that is the culture of ISRO. So, and in India, like if we talk about industrial revolution in India, like Jamshedji Tata or BARC, Homi Bhabha or Vikram Sarabhai. So these are very specific cases. Like if you see India today, because of one or two individual specific activities, it is flourishing. Like
I love this.
In the West, there is a institutionalized, like if you want to do research, the entire institution supports you. Here, people, one individual fights against it. The milk revolution in India by Varghese Kurian is also an example. So like this. So that is why I had this question. Okay,
Very beautiful. Please write to me. Send me an email.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. We have two more questions in line.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. So I was wondering about something. Firstly, the thing that the previous speakers, the previous questioner asked about one individual's making change. It reflects the kind of debate that happened quite a long time ago between Carlyle and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Carlyle was of the opinion that there were some leaders and great men who make change, on the other hand, Emerson was of the view that every human had it in himself to make change. Anyways, the question for me is, we have through the centuries gone through many maxims by great people such as Confucius or Indian mystics or Kant or perhaps the Golden Rule, which tries to sum up all different moral propositions. So if anyone were to ask you about such a maxim for us to follow in the modern world to effectively go forward into the future, what would that maxim be?
So for me, the only thing that can save mankind is love, and it is devotion to God. I think secularism is a big problem, especially in the West. I think the human species can only survive if people understand the truth that is in fundamental, the fundamental truth that is in religious approach that is found in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Christianity, in Judaism, in Islam, in all of them. I find the same truth. I find the same truth pointing to the same God. And once you see this, then you realize that God is looking at you from other people. So you see God in every other person. So it is exactly as I read it in the Bhagavad Gita. It is exactly as I read it in Christian sources. And I think this is the only thing that can save mankind. Once you realize this, your life also becomes completely different, because the life becomes very beautiful, and every difficulty that is brought from outside to you is an opportunity that is sent by God for your soul to grow, and you can respond in a very different way. And the books that I'm writing now are very much on precisely that question. What is it that can save mankind? And what is really the purpose of our life? The purpose of our life is to give love from this fragile perspective that we find ourselves in. And this is love for God, and love for God means love for other people.
Thank you, Professor.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your wonderful lecture. I have two questions actually. First is, I think in indirect reciprocity, you told one line that my behavior depends on what you have done to others. I have the question, is it entirely dependent on my independent observation of what the other person is doing to other people, or is it dependent on also the opinion of the people I trust around me?
Exactly, it's also the opinion of the people you trust. So indirect reciprocity works very well if, in addition to direct observation, you learn about others from others. That's very important.
So in that case, can we call that like, I mean, it's not, it depends on their judgment also, right? So the factor which I'm relying upon, it is also dependent on their judgments, which cannot be equal to my judgment
That's
at
right. And
certain times.
this is a very important remark, and this is a problem of indirect reciprocity. So the problem of indirect reciprocity is, can you really trust the judgment of others? And if somebody gives you wrong information, this becomes a kind of defection on another level. So the real indirect reciprocity theory has then different levels of cooperation and defection. One sort of in the real world in terms of behavior, another level of cooperation and defection by distributing wrong or correct information. So cooperation means on the second level to give truthful information about others. And in politics, very often defection is used and to distribute lie about others. And this becomes a problem of cooperation and defection on the next level. Then you need a level above this. And this is a complication of indirect reciprocity. So indirect reciprocity breaks down if people distribute lies. And in politics, I think very often this is the case.
Thank you. And the second was more of a curiosity just query that you mentioned that sometimes help the people with bad reputation, but this does not necessarily mean the badly reputed person is doing bad works all the time. So it's more of doing, if that person is doing good work or bad work, it depends on the nature of the work they are doing, not the person, I guess. I mean, you can help a person who has done a lot of bad works, but not currently doing a bad work and doing something normal or something good. You can help them at that point, right? So we should not be judgmental about the person, rather the work, I guess.
Yes, this is completely right. I admire your remark very, very much. And I think Western society, especially American society, is very much suffering from being too judgmental. And so to decide that somebody is really bad and therefore you cannot possibly support such a person in any way. And I always consider this a mistake by secular people. And I think Gandhi correctly said, I leave judgment to God. And I think this is the only approach that you can really have. You have to be very careful about judging other people, and you should always assume the best in other people. And even if the person has done something bad, it is still God's presence within the other person. So Gandhi said, I leave judgment to God.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Martin, thank you for a very good lecture, Varun here. I think the whole hall was excited with your cooperation. Everybody got. So we are looking in the mood of cooperation. So we are looking forward for your next presentation on the game theory of love. So we hope we will soon hear it. If possible,
Yes.
you can make it pure love.
Sorry?
You can make it game theory of pure love.
Yes. I would love that. That would be great. But I have definitely books. Books will come out very soon.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.